Hi, everyone. This is the recording for the class of Friday, March 19. Uh, this, uh, um, this clip contains the second half of the presentation using the PowerPoint slides about the new left in Latin America. So I am going to start sharing my screen so that I can pick up where I left. And well, this is it. Let me move my screen out of the way. Okay. So if you missed the first half, make sure you watch the previous video so that you understand why I'm talking about this now. But anyway, where we left last time was the idea that different countries in Latin America in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, different countries adopt different models and different, I call these different shades of left. And the common denominator, I said, was that even after the fall of the socialist, bloc, the Soviet Union, which was a big event for the world, the left, at least in Latin America, is still relevant because the argument goes something like this. The original causes that produce this new left in Latin America are still alive, which have to do with poverty, social injustice, violence, and things like that. So yes, like we said, it can be argued that all these presidents and their cabinets of leftist with leftist agendas were elected, by democratic means, and this was the reflection of this popular discontent, dissatisfaction with the neoliberal policies introduced through the Washington Consensus, because they fail to deliver the benefits that were promised, more equity, more participation, more economic inclusion. So it was not by force, it was not the military, it was through democratic means that these political platforms won all these spaces throughout Latin America. Let me see. Now, a very important implication of this is that there seems to be a consensus that market forces alone cannot guarantee these benefits, this social inclusion, this elimination, if possible, of poverty, diminishing of social inequities. Now, the consensus also includes the idea that to achieve this, the government needs to intervene in some cases in an important way, as regulator, as policymaker, as the framework under which a good, efficient market should operate. So that was the idea in the mind of many people in Latin America in the left, again in the late 1990s, early 2000s, and of course, not surprisingly, many of these governments start implementing very large and highly visible anti-poverty programs. Remember, we're talking about a populist agenda. So we are the saviors, they say. We know the formula to get you out of poverty, to give you what you need, and of course, they were able, in most cases, to finance these anti-poverty programs and these populist policies, not with printing money like in the past, not by engaging in debt. No, they had the fortune, in a way, that during those days, we saw the explosive growth of countries like China, like India, Pakistan, that had a big appetite for raw materials and for resources that Latin America has always had in abundance. So I'm talking about oil, gas, copper, many other minerals, including gold, silver. So this produced a boom in the price of all these commodities that obviously benefited, were of great help for these Latin American countries to finance these populist policies. And you can see here that I am putting in parentheses temporarily, because once again, the Dutch disease was always lurking around. It's great when the price of these commodities goes up, because suddenly you have this influx of revenue, but this is likely to be temporary. It's not going to be forever. The world economic conditions are going to change. Sometimes has to do with finances, sometimes has to do with technology, war, or something. And then the price of these commodities goes down, and that produces a problem, right? Now, this chart illustrates why many of these governments were able to grab power, and in many cases get reelected, not only once, but sometimes twice, if the constitution of those countries allow them. So on the left, you have here on green, a measure called Gini coefficient. Gini coefficient is used to measure income inequality. So when you see a reduction in the Gini coefficient, it means that income equality improves, or inequality goes down. In other words, the distribution of income improves. So if you look at these populist governments like Argentina, Venezuela, or even the social democratic governments, which are the most moderate, like Chile, Brazil, and Uruguay, well, with the exception of Uruguay, you see that the Gini coefficient is going down, which basically means that in many of these cases, at least the ones on the screen, these populist policies that have to do with, rescuing the poor were effective. Income inequality was going down. Poverty numbers were going down, at least for the early 2000s. And again, this is just because they were riding on this wave of high commodity prices that, as I said already, proved to be temporary. There is a place that I recommend to all of you that could give you important information about what's happening in Latin America. Most of this service is free in Spanish. So if you speak Spanish, that's great because it's free. But they also have the same information in English, but you have to pay for it. So this is called the Latino Barometer, which basically means a barometer is this device that is used to measure the pressure. But in this particular case, the idea is to measure, to take the pulse of the socioeconomic and political conditions of Latin America. So it's a survey, it's a massive survey. And they do this every year in many countries in Latin America. And the good thing is that you can, they have been doing this for many, many years. So you can see how things have changed over time in a particular country, or you can actually compare what's happening across different countries. So what's happening in Mexico versus what's happening in Chile or Colombia, right? Anyway, I'm just gonna present a couple of things in Spanish. I can translate this for you, just to give you a glimpse of how these numbers look like and how they can be useful. So the first one reads, how just or how fair is the distribution of wealth in your country? That's basically the question, the justice in the distribution of wealth. And the answers here are very just or just, which basically means like fair or very fair. So notice that in the early 2000s, all the way to 2010, I guess, there was a dramatic increase from 11% of the total population responding yes, is just or very just, all the way to the 20%. Basically reflecting what I just said before regarding the Gini coefficient. So if the Gini coefficient goes down, meaning wealth income inequality decreases, well, the perception also among the population is that the distribution of wealth is also improving. And again, all this is happening where when leftist governments are in power in Latin America. Here is an interesting one too. Is the government serving for the majority of the population rather than just a few? And well, you can see the differences between 2010 and 2011, but obviously you see Chile, Brazil, which are two of the moderate leftist countries. You see the percentages relatively high. In Venezuela, 37, 40%, slightly below the average, which is 35 for Latin America, but you can see Bolivia, for example, here. Anyway, again, the perception was that a bigger government was not so bad, Now, here is an interesting one that reflects some cultural elements in Latin America. So how much trust do you have or do you place in the institutions? And this is a good way to understand what we normally think of these institutional arrangements, right? So here you have the church, the radio, television, newspapers, banks, the government, the army, the private enterprise, the state, local governments, the police, the parliament, public administration, the judiciary, unions, and political parties. Look at this, political parties, interestingly, always rank last, well, the point I want to highlight is that even in 2010, centuries after colonization and centuries after, the Spanish had left, the institution that Latin Americans trust the most is still the church. In some small localities, when there is a conflict, it's not uncommon that the parties, rather than going to the sheriff or the local police station, first they go to the church to look for the priest. They have more trust and more confidence in the resolution, solving resolution problems for problems in the priest than in the chief of police, which is kind of interesting because obviously civil law is what should solve the dispute. But rather than that, many Latin American people prefer to go to the Catholic teachings for solving some of the problems they have. But anyway, again, this is just to give you a glimpse of how, there are hundreds of questions, and some of them may be of more interest than others, depending on what you're trying to do. But it's very widely known worldwide. It's a very strong survey, Latino Barometer. Anyway, so let's talk about what have been the criticisms or were at the time the criticisms of the new left. Because although it seemed like for a while it was working, obviously things happen that derail this declining in poverty, this decline in inequality. Something happened. Anyway, so these are a few criticisms. I already spoke about Sebastian Edwards, this Chilean economist that last time I checked, he was working at UCLA here, down the road. Basically, he argues that if the neoliberal policies fail, it was because policymakers in Latin America stopped short of completing the implementation. That it was not the policies were not implemented correctly, that institutions were not reformed, that property rights were not being protected, absent rule of law. So when all of these elements are absent, neoliberal policies are likely to fail. But this is not that the policies themselves are wrong, incorrect, or inappropriate. The problem, according to Sebastian Edwards, is that we try to place these policies in an environment that was not conducive for, blossoming, for producing fruit. So as a consequence, Sebastian Edwards argues, even today, he says, Latin American countries are, full of red tape, large and inefficient governments, corruption, protectionism, lack of competition, weak institutions. Well, yeah, because he says you never took care of the institutional framework before implementing this reform. It's an interesting argument. However, remember, when all of these neoliberal policies were imposed in Latin American countries, it was because of the debt crisis. They didn't have a choice. They didn't have time to implement all these preconditions previous to the implementation of the policies. So that's an interesting argument. However, has this flaw that assumes Latin America had a choice when in fact it didn't. Here's another interesting argument. The populist policies in Latin America, the argument goes, have nothing to do with social justice. They base these political platforms on wealth distribution. We are going to protect your family, we are going to help you, and all of these things. But the argument says that this was just a means to grab and to hold to power, because what happens after is that rather than having efficient governments, efficient state-owned enterprises, efficient court system, judiciary system, we didn't, in Latin America, we didn't get that. We had a bloated government, bureaucracy, still a high level of corruption, weak competition, weak institutions. So maybe the idea of appealing to the masses using this rhetoric was very effective. But when it came to actually make the government more efficient, that did not happen. The eradication of corruption did not happen. More competition did not happen. More, more of those things that you would assume are supposed to be happening in a dynamic, growing, developing, sustainable speaking economy did not take place. Because again, the argument goes, these populist policies had nothing to do with social justice, but more with grabbing power, right? Obviously, leadership of this movement, they are going to deny this, right? And again, unfortunately, like I said, the success or apparent success of these leftist movements was normally based on the high price of commodities that was only temporary. But eventually, they fell, the prices fell. And in order to sustain the very expensive populist policies, many of these governments ended up once again in debt, printing money. And you can see on the screen, what I call recent cases in Mexico. Obviously, this is pre 2000s, but you can see the most recent case is President Maduro in Venezuela. The price of oil, well, today in 2021 is around $70 per barrel. But what I'm talking about is when it dropped to almost $0 per barrel. So Venezuela was totally, in a really weak spot because most of the revenue for the government is coming from oil. If the price of oil is zero, you have zero revenues, right? So how are you going to sustain these massive socialist populist programs? No way. And well, that's one of the reasons, not the only reason, that Venezuela today is in such a bad shape. More contradictions. I moved too fast. Here is a very interesting one. You know, at the center of the discussion, or many of the discussions within Latin America, is who should control natural resources. I'm talking about, once again, raw materials, you know, fisheries, mining, agriculture, all of these things. Should it be the government? Should it be private enterprise? Should it be the indigenous communities that even before the Spanish came were there? You know, this is similar to, in a way, similar to the discussion about the Native Americans here in the United States. You know, who owns the land? You know, that type of controversy. And the problem in Latin America is that there seems to be this contradiction, because political parties of leftist, you know, agendas, they claim to be pro-social justice, pro the environment, anti-poverty, but at the same time, they don't want to allow indigenous movements to grab some power, to take over control of over these natural resources. And at the same time, the indigenous communities say, what are you talking about? We have been here for centuries. You just came, you know, 10 years ago. We should be in control. We should be in charge. So this disparity, this friction between the political parties of leftist agendas and the indigenous communities for the control of natural resources has been a really, really heated debate, because it's not, the answer to this question is not clear. You know, I think the only point of agreement of these two entities, parties and indigenous communities, is that private enterprises should not be in control. Because when that happens, you have multinational corporations taking over, like it happened in the case of Mexico, for instance, in Chihuahua. You have all these Canadian companies, you know, chopping trees for Canadian paper manufacturing companies. And they, you know, the deforestation has been terrible. The displacement of indigenous communities in this place in Chihuahua, in Mexico has been terrible too. Anyway, so there are some bad experiences that basically they are used as, you know, to scare people of, you know, private enterprise taking over control of natural resources. Now, here is an interesting question. A question that was framed not today, but in the early 2000s, when, you know, the debate about the new left and the role of the new left in Latin America was on the table. Is it possible that these leaders and these policies are truly different from these neoliberal predecessors? You know, at what extent are these policies and these programs are going to become a new and effective development agenda? Is it possible that these policies really, at the very heart of those policies, are pursuing noble goals, social goals that are going to promote sustainable economic development, that are going to promote investment, employment, growth? Is it possible? Or, you know, like I said before, you know, 2 or 3 weeks ago, Latin America is going to be the eternal land of the future. Tomorrow, this will happen tomorrow. And tomorrow comes and the rhetoric is still the same. Well, tomorrow, you'll see, you just wait. You know, and these three questions, or these several questions, are very important today in 2021, because things, like I said before, are still unfolding. In some of these countries, many of these policies fail, and the country starts swinging back to the right. In some other countries, more radical they actually start swinging more towards the left. And some other countries are still in between. Many of these countries are just swinging between left and right, because, you know, to appeal to the majority of the population, they have discovered that going to the extremes is not very useful. So they try to be less radical in order to appeal to a relatively small segment of the other side, on both sides, right? Anyway, we are gonna, again, this is the second half of the class. We are going to start answering many of these questions as we move on. Let's see. Well, this is an interesting slide, in the sense that as long as there is an improvement in the terms of trade, meaning as long as the price of these commodities like oil, gas, lithium, in the case of Bolivia, for example, lithium is this component for the batteries of cell phones and computers. Anyway, any of those minerals, agricultural goods, and raw materials, as long as the price of those things keeps going up, improving the terms of trade, it is possible that many of these policies in leftist Latin American governments can continue producing some of these benefits. But of course, this is a very dangerous proposition because of the Dutch disease, because of the instability of the commodity prices. So we have to keep that in mind, that you know, putting all your eggs in one basket is probably not a good idea. And the lesson should be to diversify. Some leftist governments are in the process of diversifying. You know, at some extent Ecuador, at some extent Nicaragua, extreme cases of the opposite, of course, once again, Venezuela. Now, so what are the, I'm going to start summarizing this. What are the main elements, or where the main elements of the new left in Latin America? Political parties, groups, movements, leaders in general, whether you are on the extreme or on the moderate left, typically emphasize the following points. Change over continuity. We need to change the current situation because it's not working for the poor, it's not working for the masses. Democracy and human rights over domestic security. Well, we need to take care of, once again, the poor, and we need to consolidate the democratic means for the selection of leadership. National identity and sovereignty over economic integration. There is this closing in, the idea that we should be looking for ourselves first, and later, if possible, we need to start helping others. So national identity was emphasized significantly during the New Left years. Justice over economic performance, same idea. Subsidies over fiscal rigor. So many of these governments neglected the importance of keeping inflation under control, and they start subsidizing food, education, health, transportation, many other sectors, which was very expensive, right? National control of natural resources over market-oriented free enterprise policy. So they basically took over important sectors of the economy. Again, electricity, gas, oil, etc. Income distribution and equity over competitiveness. This is the never-ending conflict in economics. You know, what should we emphasize more, efficiency or equity? Well, the New Left decided that equity was more important than efficiency. And again, the last one is social spending over controlling inflation. So this is just kind of a quick summary of the main tenets, the main propositions of the New Left in Latin America. Again, regardless of whether you are moderate or simply a moderate, a radical, or simply a moderate. All right. So some final thoughts. yes, the success of the left has been frequently framed as a backlash against globalization, against neoliberal policies, against all these pro-market reform. And it is true that globalization and the reduction in the public sector has helped the left in the ballot box, meaning that's how they have been winning elections. However, it is very interesting, or it was very interesting to see that many of these Latin American economies in the early 2000s, yes, they increased the amount of public spending, creating inflation through subsidies and public expenses in general. But they did not retreat from the world economy. Even they understood that withdrawing completely from the world markets was not a good idea. Surviving on your own is almost impossible, because in order to do that, you need to produce all the food, all the medicine, all the clothes, all the equipment that you need within your country if you don't want to depend on the world. But, there are no countries that can do that. Even North Korea, if you want to go to the extreme, that is completely isolated. They, in case you don't know, they conduct a lot of international trade overseas, through tanks and things like that. So even North Korea has to get out and buy things that they don't produce themselves. So the point I'm trying to make is that it's not so much a withdrawal of Latin American countries from globalization. It's more of a repositioning, a re-equilibration of these economies where they want to use a larger, more powerful government to protect the domestic population from the heat and the influence and the potential damage from globalization. But it's not that they are cutting ties with the rest of the world. No, what they want to do is keep the ties, but use the government as a protective mechanism in case something goes wrong, right? So think about this as, again, as a reposition, re-equilibration of forces. Number two, and this is important for your papers, for understanding how different countries went different ways, even today. Remember, I've been talking about the radical and the moderate left. And the moderate left has also been labeled the social democratic left. This group of people are typically more open-minded, more modern, more in favor of internationalization, more in favor of globalization. So they understand what's going on in the world a lot better than the radicals. And of course, this group of countries and this group of people are typically less likely to make the mistakes of the past. Now, if you contrast this with the radical left, the populist left, these guys tend to be louder, less open-minded, more nationalist, more entrenched, more close to this idea of cutting ties with the rest of the world. Not necessarily they will do it, but at least they speak about it. That's the rhetoric. And of course, these guys are likely to repeat the mistakes of the past. So on this group, you have, once again, Venezuela, at some extent, Bolivia, Nicaragua, perhaps. On the Social Democrats, you have Brazil, Argentina, Ecuador. Anyway, so again, think about this as part of the explanation of what's happening today in many of these countries. Now, it's important also to understand that the Latin American left is not necessarily pro-East or pro-West, or pro-markets or pro-government. No. The new left is taking this position of being the entity and the institutions and the framework necessary in Latin America in favor of social reform and progress. That's how they identify themselves. They typically, although, again, the radicals like to identify with, radical thinkers of the past, Marx and others. Most of the more moderate, they don't do that. They say, don't classify me either, pro-East, pro-West, pro-capitalism, pro-socialist. No. What we are after is after genuine, true social reform, sustainable economic development, progress for everybody. In that sense, many people agree that the left is going to survive and is going to continue making a difference by, once again, existing, fighting, pressuring, provoking. In that sense, as a counterbalance or counterbalancing force to the strength of globalization and the strength of the neoliberal policies around the world right now, I even can see that Latin America can be an important contributor in order to make Latin America a better place for Latin American people. Here's another interesting one that I really want to emphasize. The US is not an external actor. The IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization are still active in Latin America today. They still promote free privatization, free trade, and this is the influence I'm talking about, the strength of the globalization forces. The Drug Enforcement Administration, the CIA, the FBI are present all the time today in Latin America. And all of these, sometimes it's in the name of fighting narco trafficking, sometimes it's in the name of fighting terrorism. There's always a very good excuse to have police, military presence, or financial presence in Latin American countries. But also, this is a way to have these Latin American countries on check. As a matter of foreign policy, it's not convenient to the US that the Latin American region steers too much to the left, because we don't want another Cuba. We don't want, to allow the presence in the continent of countries and forces that are not amicable to the interest of the United States. So, for example, China has been talking about building a new canal in Nicaragua. That Venezuela is, flirting with Middle Eastern countries, with North Korea, with Russia, right? The same in Bolivia. I don't know how many of you know this, but in many of these Latin American countries today, speaking about COVID, for example, there is a Russian vaccine, there is a Chinese vaccine that, of course, we barely hear about in the US. But these countries, many of these countries that are friends or friendly to Russia and China, are receiving loads of these vaccines. Think about it. They want to show friendship, they want to show closeness, they want to show that they are partnering in this quest for the solution of big problems, right? Trying to, the point I'm making is that Latin America has always been this ground for fighting between, capitalist forces represented in Latin America by the US and non-capitalist forces, and sometimes it's the Russian, sometimes the Chinese, sometimes it's North Korea, and sometimes are other countries that are not necessarily friends with us here in the US. But the point is, if Latin America fails or keeps failing to achieve this sustainable economic development, to reach progress, to really get in the right track? Well, guess what? This is going to have implications for the US. We are going to see a continuation of immigration. This could create a risky business climate because many countries like Venezuela start nationalizing foreign enterprises. So if there was a Canadian company or an American company, the state basically took over. And they can do many things that can be very costly for businesses from other countries, the US, for example. This could also imply the disruption in the flow of oil or gas, from Venezuela or Ecuador, if they decide we don't want to sell you. This could also compromise the diplomatic cooperation. So, for example, in 2003, when the UN was trying to get the votes necessary to invade Iraq in the United Nations, Chile and Mexico said, no, we abstain. We don't want to support you guys. So, I mean, in the diplomatic world, this can also produce dramatic implications for decision-making. And of course, if poverty, inequality, social injustice keep existing or deepening in Latin America, guess what? You are going to see, unfortunately, an increase in drug trafficking, smuggling, counterfeiting, money laundering, human trafficking, organ trafficking, all of these illicit activities that Latin American people see these as the survival tools, because they cannot find regular jobs, they cannot find stable sources of income. They don't have a place. They just don't have a place in the legal formal economy. Obviously, there is mean, bad people in the world anyway, and they would do it regardless of whether there are spaces or not. But like I said before, in many of these cases, people participating in these illicit activities do so because they see the world in a very different light. They just don't find the spaces they need to participate in a licit, legal, formal way. All right, and finally, this is part of the update. Is Latin America today swinging back to the right? Well, not quite. In red, you have all the countries that are still governed today by leftist governments. So at the top, you have Venezuela, then you have Argentina, Bolivia, although Evo Morales left. Remember, after a few weeks of centrist rightist president, that she's now in jail, Luis Arce took over, which is sort of a puppet of Evo Morales. So the left is still pretty strong in Bolivia, Nicaragua, Ecuador, and more recently, Mexico. So the left has still a very, very strong presence in Latin America. Not doing as well as before. Obviously, Venezuela is in huge troubles, for example. But they are still a political force in Latin America that, well, is not clear if or when they are going to leave. In blue, you have countries that used to be in the left, like Brazil, under Lula da Silva, but now you have Bolsonaro, that in 2019, he's a businessman, totally with a right agenda from the right. So it was a 180-degree change. However, just recently, da Silva, Lula da Silva, received very good news from the federal court, basically leaving him free. And now he is talking about challenging Bolsonaro again in the, I think it's 2022 elections in Brazil. So we may see the comeback of Lula da Silva in Brazil pretty soon, in a couple of years. which will turn Brazil red again. Uruguay is swinging to the right. Chile, after Michelle Bachelet in red, now has Piñera, that obviously is blue in the right. Guatemala, El Salvador, Peru, and I have El Salvador and Peru, particularly El Salvador, because they are undergoing a massive political crisis, and again, we can talk about this individually. If you are interested in El Salvador, I know we have here in the Valley many people from the Central America, so we can talk about that. But anyway, the point I'm trying to make here in this slide is that it's not clear yet today what's going to happen in the region. Some countries seem to be swinging back to the right. Some other countries are still pretty much toward the left. So Latin America is not as red as it used to be, but this is still pretty red. This is still pretty red, guys. Anyway, I think I'm going to stop now. Let me stop sharing my screen. I'm going to stop here. Again, I wish we could have a conversation now, but of course we can't because this is just a recording. Anyway, I will see you live on Monday for a next section. If you have questions or comments, please let me know. Email, stop by during office hours. You know what to do. All right. Bye, guys.